Jai Hind and welcome to the 10th episode of Open Court with MJ Akbar. Today we'll jump straight into our topic on the Russia-Ukraine war. Mr. Akbar, to start with, Kyiv will fall any time now. They are just fighting 20 miles off Kyiv. Gunfights and aerial bombing have already started. What do you think is the grand plan of Russia? Was Putin already planning for the overthrow of the Ukrainian government and install his own puppet government in Ukraine?
Let's try and keep the language balanced rather than falling into the trap laid down by the creation of semantics. His puppet government and so on and so forth. I mean, Putin equally accuses the present government of being a puppet of the NATO. So the lots of puppets in play. We should not fall into the trap of being looking one-sided or one side or the other. But be that said, your larger question, this is clearly a well thought and thought through campaign. As we speak, you're hearing gunshots outside Kyiv. I am hearing something else, which I think in the larger context is significantly more important, which is the president of Ukraine, the present president of Ukraine, Zelensky's speech, which he made late last night. He was looking very dejected. He was looking quite out of his depth. And he was wearing a T-shirt for heaven knows what reason. It was not quite the most appropriate dress to wear when you're addressing the nation at a moment of perceived crisis. And what was his main theme? His main theme was that he had been left alone. Apart from a personal sort of complaint that he was the target, his family was going to be the second target, which perhaps in his present state of mind is understandable. But in the larger context, his accusation to the West is that he has been left alone, that he has been abandoned. Now, I will submit to you something I think would be more substantive. He has not been abandoned today after the invasion. He was abandoned in December 2021. When did the Russians begin mobilizing? They began mobilizing in December. How many weeks have passed since then? Within this space of time, right, the world, the West, actually not the world, the West had two options. Either it could accept Russia's position that Ukraine could never become a member of NATO, right? And by the way, this is not as dramatically pro-Russian or pro-Moscow position as might seem in the present rhetoric. Dr. Henry Kissinger, and nobody has ever accused Dr. Kissinger of being a dove. I mean, he is as much of a hawk or, a patriot or whatever you like as they come. He has said openly and repeatedly that Ukraine has to be cannot be part of NATO. Now, here I'm going to pick up a name from the other side of the Russian spectrum, which is Solzhenitsyn, the famous author of, anti-communist author of the Gulag series. And hostile to the communists, of course, came out. He began the dissident movement, perhaps one of the most prominent names of the day. He too has said that Ukraine is a part of Russia. Certain facts are easily forgotten. That till 1954, Crimea was not part of Ukraine. The present eastern provinces have always been in some form of dispute or the other. Now, either the West, which is basically led by the Biden-Boris Anglo-American alliance, and I say it's led by that because the status of Ukraine was actually determined by the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which was signed by America, England, Britain, Russia, and Ukraine. And they, as I said, they were leading the chorus. And they could have accepted, all right, we accept that it's not, or they could have mobilized, or they could have sent troops. Today, the British are sending troops to fighter planes and troops to the Baltic states, thereby accepting that this is a clear line. But from the beginning, the status of Ukraine was a fudge, which in which the West was as much a part of the fudge as was the Russia today and Soviet Union yesterday. So to say that this is something new, uh, Putin himself has been saying is that he's been asking for talks for 3 decades or whatever it is, but certainly for 2.5 decades, and consistently it remains what has been said to be, and I think Ukraine has now become a victim of quote unquote strategic ambiguity. It may be ambiguity may be very useful for superpowers, but it's very, very dangerous for a nation squeezed in between. And finally, I will say this much, that Putin took the measure of Biden and Boris Johnson in Afghanistan. When he saw the abject retreat of America from Kabul, despite being in a fairly strong position till the till the eve of the retreat, when they suddenly packed up their bags and disappeared, he got the measure of both Biden and Boris in Afghanistan. And after that, for him to take what would be the decisive second step after the acquisition of Crimea in 2014 was a matter of very little time. The whole thing begins in 2014 with the acquisition of Crimea. In 2015, Ukraine makes its first substantive request to NATO to become a member, and from then on, the crisis begins to develop.
Mr. Akbar, this leads to my second question, which you have covered a little bit in your statement. We all know that Russian and Ukraine, the origin of the Slavic people was from a region called Kievan Rus, and that's where the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Slavic people sort of migrated in different parts of Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, coming to the point where you mentioned that this is a failure of the Western powers and NATO, would it be wrong for us sitting in India to say that what Putin is doing is a colonial project where he's trying to build up his own image, where he's trying to try forcing or maybe trying for a reunification of USSR? Would that be a wrong statement to make?
There has to be a very clear difference between nations, large nations in particular, sense of its strategic security and what you are now calling colonialism. I mean, just read the statements which are being issued from Moscow, rather than reading only the statements being issued from Washington and London. Repeatedly, Putin has compared this to what he calls the nuclearization or the armed army, and he claims at least that the Kyiv government so far had been, as I said, acolyte of NATO. He has been comparing it to Cuba in 1962, when America reacted to the presence of nuclearization of Cuba. America had very good strategic reasons. One of the most important aspects of the strategic equation is the time taken by a missile from its base to target. Right? If the 62 crisis began when America put missile stations in Turkey, which is much near Moscow, and then Khrushchev then responded by trying to put missiles into Cuba. Now, why is the time important? Because the response time of the country which is going to be attacked becomes very limited. I think Putin himself said that if, for example, such weapons were placed in Ukraine, then the response time is only 3 to 4 minutes. Not enough time, right? But the response time from a more distant country would be larger for anyone to make. So the same logic that America used then is being used by Putin 6 decades later. By the way, those who want to preserve the status quo, it should be made into a law, must preserve it with as much tenacity as those who want to change the status quo are using.
अकबर
अकबर
साहब, जिस
साहब,
तरह से भारत की नेतृत्व क्षमता को देखते हुए यूक्रेन ने भारत से मध्यस्थता की मांग की, भारतीय प्रधानमंत्री ने बात भी की व्लादिमीर पुतिन से। भारत कितना कामयाब हो सकता है युद्ध को रोकने के लिए, और भारत की भूमिका कितनी सीमित हो गई है इस समय?
देखिए, भारत जो है यूरोप के स्ट्रेटेजिक मैप पे अपनी में सच्ची बात तो ये है कि इस कॉन्फ्रंटेशन कोल्ड वॉर में अभी जो स्थिति है उसमें भारत की कोई खास जगह नहीं है। लेकिन हाँ, प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी की अपनी एक हैसियत है, अपनी एक आवाज़ है, ये उनकी निजी आवाज़ है जो उन्होंने अपने फॉरेन पॉलिसी, अपनी नीतियों से, अपनी लीडरशिप से कई वर्षों में, ये 7 वर्षों में, 8 वर्षों में जो उन्होंने बनाया है, तो उसके तहत आज प्रेसिडेंट पुतिन भी उनसे बात करते हैं। मेरा तो एक और मानना है, तो इन मामलों में मैं ज़रा सा क्या कहिए रियलिस्टिक हूँ। जो कैंपेन है उसको मुझको लगता है अभी तो हम बीच में हैं कि मॉस्को का जो असेसमेंट है उसमें वो ये रविवार तक अपना काम, अपने ऑब्जेक्टिव्स पूरे कर ले, और जो सीज फायर की मांग आज हुई है वो एक तरह से उसको भी मतलब मॉस्को का रिस्पांस हमें बताता है कि हाँ भाई डिप्लोमेटिक चैनल्स खुलने चाहिए। क्यों, कभी ना कभी तो डिप्लोमेटिक दरवाजे खुलने ही पड़ेंगे, तो बात कैसे होगी? आज नहीं तो कल तो बात करना ही पड़ेगा, इसी विश्व में सबको रहना है। तो इसलिए मेरा ख्याल ये सारे कैलकुलेशंस हो रहे हैं, और उन कैलकुलेशंस में मुझे लगता है, देखिए जो पुतिन के ऑब्जेक्टिव्स हैं, 3 ऑब्जेक्टिव्स तो बहुत बड़े हैं, वो मुझे लगता है कि उन्होंने वो हासिल कर चुके हैं या कर रहे हैं। एक तो उनका कि ये जो ईस्टर्न प्रोविंसेस है उनको उन्होंने इंडिपेंडेंस, एक्सेप्टेंस और रिकग्निशन दे दी है। वो स्थिति शायद अब कोई बदलने वाला नहीं है, चाहे वेस्ट उसे रिकग्नाइज करे ना करे। तो एक तरह से यूक्रेन का मैप तो बदल गया है। दूसरा, उनकी ऑब्जेक्टिव्स हैं जो मैं कहता हूँ द न्यू नॉर्मल। द न्यू नॉर्मल इज बीइंग एस्टेब्लिश्ड इवन एज वी स्पीक, जिसमें द रेड लाइन ऑफ यूरोप अब हो जाएगा, विल नाउ बिकम Poland, Romania and the Baltic states, right, rather than Ukraine. Or Ukraine, Belarus will have to remain, according to the new consensus, in the Russian sphere of influence. आप इसको, ये कोई नई बात नहीं है। हम हर बार समझते हैं जैसे कोई बहुत आश्चर्यजनक नई बात हो गई है। ये 1939 में जब एक समझौता हुआ था रशिया और जर्मनी के बीच में, तब भी ये इश्यूज उठे थे। वेस्ट ऑफ द डेनाइपर क्या होगा, ईस्ट ऑफ द डेनाइपर क्या होगा, क्योंकि जो ईस्टर्न है इलाका है वो रशियन ऑर्थोडॉक्स चर्च और रशियन स्पीकिंग इलाका है। जो वेस्टर्न है वो अलग है, वो कैथोलिक है और वो यूक्रेनियन ज़्यादा बोलता है वगैरह। और तो न्यू नॉर्मल जो वैसे मैंने कहा, ये शायद अब एस्टेब्लिश हो जाएगा। ये 2 ऑब्जेक्टिव्स हो गए हैं। और तीसरा, पुतिन ने सीरिया के इंटरवेंशन के साथ एशिया के स्ट्रेटेजिक मैप या वेस्ट एशिया के स्ट्रेटेजिक मैप को तो बदल ही दिया है। वेस्ट एशिया इज़ फार यूरोप, क्योंकि मेडिटेरियन के पूर्व में, दीज ऑल मेडिटेरियन कंट्रीज पूर्व में है। और अब आफ्टर चेंजिंग द मैप ऑफ फार यूरोप, ही हैज चेंज्ड द मैप ऑफ ईस्ट यूरोप वंस अगेन। योल्टा में 1945 में, 46 में, सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर के बाद भी जो समझौते हुए थे, वो इस समझौते में दोनों एरियाज के स्फीयर ऑफ इन्फ्लुएंस को बरकरार रखा था। और वैसे कोल्ड वॉर कहते हैं, लेकिन कोल्ड वॉर में थोड़ी बहुत स्टेबिलिटी भी थी, क्योंकि सब दोनों तरफ को पता था कि कितनी दूर जाएंगे और कहाँ हम रुकेंगे।
Mr. But taking forward this point of yours, where Putin has changed the map of now probably Eastern Europe and also West Asia, do you think there is chance that this opportunity or this precedent can be taken up by, say, a country like China against Taiwan, even against India, where they claim Arunachal Pradesh is part of their territory? Do you think this sort of creates more security challenges for New Delhi?
Well, I'm very clear about it. Irrespective of what this impact it has upon the rest of the world, and what thinking it might encourage in China, China will be watching extremely carefully. There is no doubt about it. They will be measuring their ability to strike as well. They will be also checking whether America will be as dominant in the Pacific as Europe is dominant as West Europe is dominant in East Europe. It is not like to like. It's not like to like at all. The Americans are not going to surrender in the Pacific as easily as today the Europe seems to have surrendered in the. If all that Europe has in its weaponry is sanctions, let me tell you something very clearly, that President Putin is not going to be frightened of Aeroflot flights being banned to Heathrow Airport, or if some oligarchs have had their money seized, and so on and so forth. And let me tell you something about sanctions. There is a lot of fraud going on. This morning we heard President Biden, a lot of fraud, by which I mean that a lot is written in small script, which is not being exposed. The headlines are being made of what is intended to be large script. Today is this round of American sanctions. I cannot say what will happen next, but this round of American sanctions, President Biden himself very clearly said that energy supplies will not be disrupted. And if energy supplies are not disrupted, then how are you taking real sanctions against Russia? Russia produces 10 billion barrels of oil a day. It is the second largest producer, I think, at the moment, right? Since the price of oil moved from 1st December from $65 to the present over $100, Russia's daily excess profit, just excess profit per day, is over $300 million. So in a sense, the rising oil prices are financing this whole military effort, right? The money is coming from the European and markets. So it's a sort of no-lose situation in many ways for the Russians. They have reserves of gold. 10% price of gold means that they have something like $10 billion worth of value added to their gold reserves. And the Americans are not in a position to really put more sanctions, because they need palladium from Russia, which produces, I think, about 90% of the world's requirements. And there are many other elements like that. It's not a one-way street. And always useful to remember that Russia is not Iran. It has far greater abilities.
जी। अकबर साहब, एक तरफ कोविड महामारी से जिस तरह से अर्थव्यवस्था धीरे-धीरे उभरने की कोशिश कर रही थी और एक बार फिर अब ये युद्ध आ गया, भारतीय अर्थव्यवस्था पर इसके क्या असर पड़ेंगे?
भारतीय अर्थव्यवस्था पे जो मतलब दुनिया में जो टर्बुलेंस होता है, तो उस पे शेयर मार्केट पे असर तो पड़ता ही है, लेकिन शेयर मार्केट तो एक छोटा सा वर्ग है, बहुत ही हल्का वर्ग है, जिसके लिए एक फाइनेंशियल सर्कस बना हुआ है। भारतीय अर्थव्यवस्था अब भारतीय आत्मनिर्भरता के ऊपर डिपेंडेंट है, और हमारे देश की इकोनॉमी हमारे देश की एंटरप्रेन्योर कैपेबिलिटीज पे डिपेंडेंट है। हमारी जो अपनी निजी पॉलिसीज है, उससे हमारी अर्थव्यवस्था आगे बढ़ेगी या रुकेगी या जो भी होगा, लेकिन विदेश से हम उतने जुड़े नहीं हैं जितना आपके प्रश्न में झलक है।
कीमतों में बढ़ोतरी होती है तो फिर बाकी चीजों पर भी असर होता है।
हाँ, तेल का होता है। ये पहली बार नहीं है। जब ओपेक हुआ था तो ओपेक में तेल की बढ़ोतरी हुई थी, शायद $3 से लेके $12 तक। इंदिरा गांधी उस वक्त प्रधानमंत्री थी और कीमतें बढ़ी थी। कीमतें बिना युद्ध के भी बढ़ती, तो कीमतें जो हैं मार्केट कंडीशन से है, हम एनर्जी डिपेंडेंट हैं, तो और आज तक हमारी एनर्जी सप्लाईज में शायद कतर के सिवा और किसी के साथ ये लॉन्ग टर्म समझौता उतना नहीं है। तो एक चीज़ तो हमने बहुत कोशिश हम करते रहते हैं, अभी भी कर रहे हैं कि इस समस्या का हल करें, लेकिन अभी भी हम मैंने अंतर्राष्ट्रीय जो प्राइसेस हैं उसके ऊपर हम डिपेंडेंट हैं और ज़रूर इसका असर तो हमारे देश पे ज़रूर है।
Mr. Akbar, speaking of sanctions, which you mentioned briefly, do you think the Western nation, even Western Europe, US, for that matter, have shot their foot on this?
Sanctions are not a shield against military action, and to think that sanctions will protect their version of Ukraine is fantasy. I'm not saying that they're right or wrong and so on. I'm merely saying that when you do the strategic calculation, when you play, strategic chess against a nuclear clock, right? Then sanctions are not sufficient, particularly when sanctions cannot be enforced to the extent that will be punitive. So far, as yet, despite everything, the West has not been able to implement a Russian ban on SWIFT because the transactions have to be cleared by the Belgian bank. And these transactions are the basis of energy supplies. This is my assumption and common sense, which is telling me no great economic insight. So to reach that point, if that point was going to be, let us say, a deal breaker, then I think we would have seen NATO troops in Ukraine in December, January, right? That would be a new sort, of confrontation. It would not be this, abandoning Ukraine kind of, bluster is not a very good weapon, frankly. This is something that the Western leaders probably should realize.
Mr. Akbar, India has been constantly saying that we should keep the channels of dialogue open. You also mentioned that Putin will now probably do that by Sunday. Do you think?
No, I didn't say to do it by Sunday. I'm saying maybe his military action objectives will have been completed by Sunday. And I can only use the word maybe. I am not as certain in my views as anchors are.
Fair enough, sir. But do you think today we are seeing the limitations of military, say, intervention or military posturing? Because frankly speaking, Ukraine has been left alone.
No, but the Russians have used military intervention. Why have they used military intervention? Precisely because they know that powerful, military powers or superpowers like America no longer want boots on the ground. How can you protect strategic space without boots on the ground? Instead, Boris Johnson is warning Putin that, the body bags will get you down. I don't know whether these people are real or not. I think Barack Obama once described Boris Johnson as saying that he reminds me of a school kid at the back of the classroom trying to make himself heard. I know. I think in the moment of crisis, these are at best inadequate measures being taken by those who think that Ukraine's, quote unquote, independence and sovereignty are life and death issues. They are not treating in real terms as a life and death issue. So why should the Russians do so?
What should India do? I know you have mentioned it earlier in this show, but what more can we do? Will India play a mediator role in this crisis?
I don't understand this question, which is asked very often. I think the best thing to do is to do as little as possible. It's very wise to do as little as possible. As I said, the Prime Minister has the stature to now built up over many years to be a possible enabler when the time for resolution comes. But everything is in the air at the moment. And I think he has sufficient experience and sufficient maturity, unlike some prime ministers who reach Moscow on the day of war, to know when to say what, right? And when to say and how to say it, right? One of the big setbacks, I think, to Pakistan diplomacy is rather the immature manner in which Prime Minister Imran Khan thought he had come to Lords to watch an exciting game of cricket. It's, you can see who is out of his depth and who is not. It's so I think we can leave it to Prime Minister Modi, who is wise enough to take a call which is in our best national interest at the right time and whenever required, without seeming too eager, right, to jump into a fray. You can also see that the Chinese have not said anything so far on this issue. Why is it necessary to keep saying something?
Yeah. True. Mr. Akbar, thank you for joining us today. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us today. Jai Hind.